recording, and then we'll get started. Do you have any questions before we get started? Ready to roll?
What are you looking to chat about today? Kind of just so I know what.
Yeah. So basically, it's going to be kind of just how you got to where you're at, what's kind of some unique kind of like how do we get strength coaches from where we're at now to in those administrative roles, kind of how that works for you, kind of what you're hoping the future kind of looks like for us. Also kind of having a inside look of just college strength and conditioning for those people who are in the Discord. The reason why I'm doing something like this is normally in the past, I like to have like my interns and assistants or whatever we have sitting down and doing something like this where it's like internally with my staff and you and whoever is available from your staff. But with my schedule and then with my kids still being in school and being very like, I can get them with team training and that's pretty much it. I usually have a 2-hour window on Wednesdays to be able to do some stuff, and unfortunately they're not available. So I figured it'd be kind of a good way to kind of kill two birds with one stone, to help out the Discord, but then to also have something for my interns as well.
Okay. Cool.
So, all righty, Coach, let's go ahead and get this started. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Chalk Talk here on the Discord. Have a great one lined up for you today. We're talking about college strength and conditioning and kind of what's the kind of come possible futures and stuff like that. So Coach, you want to give us a little bit of background of kind of where you guys started and where you're kind of looking for things to go in the future?
Yeah. Well, my background really started with having served in the military. I got out as a 27-year-old. I'd served 5 years as a military police officer, didn't really know what I wanted to do, and somehow fell into strength and conditioning. Did the typical route of going intern while you're in undergrad, and then didn't find a grad position or GA position right off the bat. And so ended up staying at Washington State University, where I completed my undergrad for another year as a paid intern. And then I went to Illinois State for 2 years, typical GA spot, working with Jim Lathrop there. And my first job out of grad school was actually as an intern for at the time, the St. Louis Rams. I, like many others, had applied all over the place, and I still have a nice box of rejection letters at home from all the other college positions that I'd applied for, and I didn't land one. And so ended up with the Rams, stayed with them for 4 years, 1 year as an intern, then 3 years a full-time assistant. Working my way up to being the top assistant for Rock Gullickson in our last season. Got fired. Coach Fisher got fired. So naturally, the rest of our staff got fired. And kind of went on a roundabout journey across the country, living out of the back of my car. I've talked about it on a couple other podcasts. Living out of the back of my car and connecting with different coaches along the way. And then I ended up later that year in 2017 going to the CFL and coaching for Mark Trestman up there for 2 seasons as a head strength coach for the Toronto Argonauts. From there, decided to come home, went to the private sector in Thousand Oaks, California. And then last year, or actually, the end of 2020, started looking for different opportunities, wanted to get back into the collegiate setting, and found this opportunity here at Santa Clara University and went through that interview process. And now I've just hit my 1-year anniversary here at Santa Clara University.
Well, first of all, congratulations on that. I know a lot of coaches can talk about, all the different states and schools and very little amounts of time. And it seems like it's almost a revolving door. So, I mean, a lot of people might say like a year doesn't necessarily sound like a long time, but in this industry, like that's just unfortunately the truth of the matter. And I think it's interesting because it seems like, and I say this a lot, but it seems like the paths to becoming either a director or assistant, whatever it is, as much as we say it's like similar, it's also completely different for a lot of people. Like, yeah, we have to do the interns and stuff, but I mean, talking about living out of your car, I don't know any other person has to deal with that. So it's like, you kind of have to almost make your own path, and you kind of like can follow some of the similar things, but don't think that, like that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, if you're looking at my situation too, I'm back in college strength and conditioning, and I haven't done that, or I hadn't done that since 2013 when I was a GA. And so it's not the typical going through, an assistant director, and then now into my role as associate AD for sports performance. And so the team that hired me here, Renee Baumgartner and Ryan Holloman, obviously they're taking a risk bringing in a guy that's never been in the collegiate setting as a full-time coach. But I think what their vision and what we've been able to do over the past year has proven that we are just really trying to grow this profession. When I first came on board in January of last year, it was myself and two other full-time coaches. We had a director of sports performance and an assistant director. And now our staff consists of myself. I have two assistant ADs, one working with men's basketball, one working with women's soccer. Then we have a director of sports performance, an assistant director of sports performance, and two part-time coaches, each getting paid for 20 hours of work per week. So it's, we've been able to build it quite a bit. And ultimately it comes down to getting support from our administration.
Do you think with your kind of like, I want to say outside perspective, because that's obviously not the case, but maybe not necessarily having to kind of like be in those grinding type positions and kind of coming up, like being able to be like, something isn't right with coaches having to work 70 hours a week, and like having that different perspective compared, like, this is what I had to do. So
Are you there?
everybody kind of has to do it. Can you hear me still? I'm gonna cut out. I can hear
you. Yeah. Sorry. If you could.
Yep, I can hear you.
I know you were rambling through that question and I actually lost you right at the very beginning. If you could just kind of go through that again.
Yeah.
And cut out a bit.
No problem. Yeah. So having kind of a perspective that's not necessarily like having to work 78-hour weeks here and there, like being able to kind of have a different perspective, saying like, this is not the way it's supposed to be just because this is what I did or didn't do. Do you think that kind of has a little bit of an impact on kind of your situation where you guys are at, or was it just a relationship type of deal with what you guys administrative wise at Santa Clara?
I think that's a great question. I think for us, ultimately, it starts with our AD, Renee Baumgartner. And by that, I mean, not a lot of ADs out there have a sport coaching background. So Renee started out as a golf coach at the University of Oregon. She was a former collegiate athlete. So once again, has that perspective of sports performance, was at Oregon under, the regime there, and had the opportunity to work with Jimmy Radcliffe, right? A legend in the field of strength and conditioning. So has been exposed to elite levels of sports performance, worked her way up, and then became a senior women's administrator. And now she's the AD. But along her career path, she was impacted by sports performance, first as an athlete, then as a coach, then as an administrator. And so, for me, that's ultimately what's allowed us to be able to make progress, because she has reference points. And a lot of times, when we see people complaining about their administration, whether it be on social media or in conversations we're having with them, a lot of times the common thread is that these administrators don't have an understanding of sports performance. And I'm not going to sit here and say Renee understands sports performance completely. However, she understands it more than 99% of administrators I've ever met, because she's experienced it as a coach, as an athlete, and as an administrator. And now she's so supportive that she still comes into the weight room, trains with us, joins our staff for Deadlift Friday whenever she's on campus, is engaged with what we're doing. And so that helps open the lines of communication when we are asking for things or explaining how we are getting things done and accomplishing the goals that we have. And so I think that's the biggest factor. And it's not necessarily my experience having been in the professional setting or an outside perspective. It's ultimately the reason I came here was because throughout the interview process, I was just exploring the opportunity. I didn't know if I wanted to go back to college and go back through that grind. However, when I talked to Ryan Holloman and I talked to Renee, it was all about their vision. And I really got the sense that based on her experience, she was going to be very supportive of the sports performance department. And I asked a lot of tough questions about that, asked about work-life balance. And, I started out here understaffed, and now we're to the point where we are having work-life balance, right? Like our staff is able to enjoy that a little bit. And I do have members of the staff that were here with the previous staff when there were only 3 coaches. And now they actually, I have a coach here, our assistant director. He doesn't have to come in because of the way we schedule our teams and do team assignments. He doesn't have to be in here till 9 or 10 in the morning. He's going out and doing stuff, doing jujitsu in the morning, spending time with his fiance who's expecting a child. They're able to have a life outside of the weight room. And that's the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously the dream that everybody talks about. Sometimes I always feel like it's not, a lot of people from the outside looking in, it's like strength coaches are complaining about doing their job, but it's like we can still do our job and get everything done that we need. But there's also it's like the old parable. You have to be able to take care of yourself before you can take care of other people. And we take care of everybody as far as athlete wise, depending on how many teams you work with. And that's something I think, especially like me being in my first director role, I struggled with early on. Was I wanted to make sure I'm making as much of an impact as possible, but then being able to also realize that like my wife would like to see me at some point, and I'd like to hang out with my dogs and like stuff like that. So something's got to give. And luckily for me, that was something that was super like when I was kind of going through the interview process, making sure that was something where it's like, obviously the job has to get done, but I also need to make sure I'm prioritizing, my own personal life too, because if I'm here all day long and my wife divorces me, then, who knows where I'll end up being at.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I completely agree. I think my perspective is obviously this is a unique situation, right? But there are other situations like this out there where you have administrators that are supportive. I think the biggest thing is as coaches, as we go through this, younger coaches, let's say assistant directors, you're going for your first director job, is really feeling comfortable asking those questions and trying to understand if the support is there. I think a lot of times, and I'm just speaking in generalizations, a lot of coaches, they're just chasing the job. They're interviewing for the job. It's more of, hey, as a coach, I'm trying to impress the administrators and I'm trying to land this job and not necessarily weed them out from being considered because I don't like what they're saying about work-life balance or the budget and all these different things. And so that is, those are some of the questions I asked. I asked about staffing, budget, how the budget set up at the time and the staffing was in line with the rest of the conference. And so when I came on board, they talked about that it was middle of the pack compared to the rest of the conference, but their goal was to set the standard within the conference and be like a Power 5 school. And so when I came on board, a couple of the coaches in the conference had started a staff and salary survey. We were looking at the positions that were available, what was paid for each position, and then the operating budget. Obviously, COVID impacted a lot of that, but we all wanted to take a look at the numbers. And when our numbers came out, we took a look at that, presented it to Ryan, who's my direct report, or who I report directly to, sorry. And then we sat down and came up with a plan to take to Renee and the rest of the executive team. Based on what we'd seen the conference was doing and what they said they wanted to do, they were able to help, move things around in the budget, which is obviously outside of my realm of responsibility, but understanding and knowing what their vision was helped me ask for the right things.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a perspective deal, I feel like. And so I'm at a Division III school, and obviously for me, I want to make sure that this place is ran to as efficiently as possible. But at some point, I need to also realize that I'm not going to have, 2 or 3 nutritionists, or I'm not going to have this and that. But instead of complaining about not having those, making sure that I'm able to utilize everything I can and almost prove that we're able to do about everything we can with very, very little, and prove that we kind of are, for a lack of better words, like worthy of having a new facility, or that I'm willing to do the work by myself, but I'm working so hard that I'm worthy enough to have an assistant. And I think that's okay. And that was a big part of my interview. And that was the first time, this was my first spot that I actually interviewed for jobs, where it wasn't like I need to apply for any job and every job. I was actually in the interview process, making sure that this was right for me. And I think that helped me in my interview, because I know in other interviews, it's like, well, what's your vision? Well, I want to make this the best place possible. And it's like, okay, cool. But like, what's your multi-year goal, instead of just being here for 6 months and then you get the next logo and then the next logo.
Yeah, I think you hit on a point there about doing the best job you can with the staff you have available. And that perspective, I think, really helped us out early on. So with the 3 coaches we had, we have 20 total teams. Our goal was to provide an even more elevated experience and training situation that they've ever had prior, right? By elevating that experience, I was then able to turn around and say, hey, listen, if this is what we're doing with 3 staff members, the coaches are now happy, the athletes are giving great feedback. Imagine what we can do with more staff members, and we're not getting burnt out. And so that was kind of how I phrased it and presented it to the staff, or to the executive team, was that, hey, take a look at what we've been able to do in the past couple months. The coaches were given feedback along the way. They were excited about the changes that had been made. And, Renee was hearing these things, but then I turn around and say, hey, listen, all this positivity is great, but imagine how much better it's going to be when we start adding all these different positions. And so when I went to her, I not only had a vision of how many staff members, but what we also did was put together a list of team assignments, how that would work. And for me, that's a very important thing, not just based on coaching personalities and different things like that, or best fit and experience coaching a particular team. But the other thing I looked at was pairing coaches with teams that were in certain time blocks. That was very important to me. So our coaches aren't here all day. I didn't want to have a coach, okay, cool, you have 2 to 3 teams, but you have a team at 6 a.m. and then 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. That still makes for a tremendously long day. And so fortunately here, our scheduling, because of academics, is block scheduling. Pretty much each quarter, we're on the quarter system. Teams have training slots that rarely ever change. And so we're able to sit down, take a look at that, and do team assignments based on time blocks as well. And the primary teams, I'd assign a coach to a primary team because that's what I thought was the best fit. But then those secondary teams that they're working with, some of the smaller teams, we pick and choose based on time slots, and really trying to make sure that the coaches, I don't have coaches with assigned teams 8 hours apart. At most, they're 6 hours apart. So you could come in, listen, you prep for your team, you do your coaching, and you're out of here in 8 to 9 hours per day. And we're not asking you to stay here 10, 12, 13 hours per day. Now, does it still happen? Oh, definitely. Because we still want our coaches showing up to competition, supporting the teams, and doing other things. But it's not an everyday process where you're just dreading going to work for 9, 10, 12 hours. So it's being very intentional about the scheduling and how we're pairing teams up. And I think that was one of the things that I really pride ourselves on having accomplished.
No, and that's something that made me think, kind of like, so I'm in the position now where it's like, I can, at some point, we're talking about having, adding a position to this staff. And kind of as a director, my options were, do I want to have multiple more like part-time coaches where they come in and maybe work 20 or 30 hours a week, but I get a couple coaches? Or do I want to try to bring in like one person who we can make sure is given enough of a benefit perspective that maybe we're could be almost like a co-head or something like that. But like thinking what you're talking about, how does it work with you guys as far as, let's say your assistant was working with women's tennis and then the next semester it's another coach? Are they communicating on what was going on before, or is it something where like there's one type of they're pulling programs, they're working together, or how exactly does that work for you guys?
No, that's a great question. So obviously we've had quite a bit of turnover here in the past year. The one thing that we did as coaches have come in is if the previous coach is still around. So we had some transition. Let's see, just trying to think off the top of my head. Softball. So when we brought Bree Cans in from Stanford, she's working with women's soccer primarily, but softball is one of our other teams. Griff, our assistant director, had been working with him. And so what we ended up doing was having a 3-week transition period. So for the first week, Griff's programming everything. Second week, they're working together. Third week, Bree's programming everything, but Griff's still around. And so for 3 weeks, both of them are in front of the team and slowly transition to where that last week it's Bree's program based on all the conversations they've now had over the past 2 weeks. But Griff's still there, providing support and really just being a presence. And that's really what we're going through now with our men's basketball team. So our men's basketball coach had left, our strength coach had left right at the start of the fall. I served as interim and I'm still in that role, but in January, we hired Allison Pappenfuss from Bowling Green to come in as the new assistant AD with men's basketball. So she's been around. I've been still programming, taking them through the warm-ups, making sure everything's rolling. But now as we near the end of the season, I'm just essentially hanging out, right? I'm here now. She's taking them through the warm-ups, doing everything, putting the workouts together, different sessions, planning everything with the ATC. And so for me, that's an important aspect too, is that if you do have the opportunity, there is overlap to make sure that there's a transition period. So there's a lot of communication involved there. And these athletes aren't getting shocked, obviously new personalities, but also new programming. And so even if Allison doesn't necessarily program the same way I do as we go through this process, she's still incorporating pieces of my warm up and my lift so that they have familiarity and it's not, oh crap, this is all a new thing, especially still in the middle of the season.
Yeah, no, and I think that's definitely a luxury and something that I think would be helpful for a lot of coaches to think about. Like, I know I'm trying to imagine how it's going to be for me. Like, we have 21 sports here, how I'm going to have to pick and choose. Like, it almost makes me feel like I'm like breaking up with the team or whatever. Like, I don't want them to feel like I'm leaving them or I'm prioritizing other people, but that's just unfortunately part of it. And hopefully we bring in someone who's probably more qualified than I am, so it's easier to kind of be like, well, they're just a better coach, and that's why you guys are getting them.
Yeah, I think, as we've gone through that, I've had to do that with one or two of my teams here. I think the biggest thing is, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. At a lot of colleges that I've seen, and I could be wrong here, a lot of times the head strength coach or the person overseeing the department takes the alpha team or one of the alpha teams, right? Excluding football, because football typically, has their own staff, but the top dog will take one of the top teams. My goal here was to serve the entire department. And so based on our structure and historically women's soccer is a powerhouse, men's basketball is the other alpha team for equity. And I chose to take neither one of those teams. I went with baseball as my primary team. And so that allows me to hire great coaches to be in those positions and service those teams, which, listen, they require a lot of time and energy, but that also opens things up so I can serve the rest of the department and help out with some of the smaller teams. And, whether that's your approach or not, I think it's a great thing to consider, just because, if you can do that, and for us as coaches, it's tough, right, to let go of that ego piece. Hey, I'm the head guy in charge, and I got to have the best team, or the big boy team here. And if we're able to let go of that, I think it allows us as coaches to serve more. and spread our reach. And so for me, that's what it's a lot of fun. Like on Saturday, went out to a water polo game, and they are very appreciative of that. Right. These are the teams that in the past didn't traditionally have a strength coach, and now going out to their events, that goodwill spreads, not just to them, but throughout the athletic department.
Yeah, that's something, and that's, yeah, I mean, that's probably the way that I'm going to have to just almost like brainwash myself into thinking, because I am super stubborn and hard-headed, but I know it'll come down to, we're just going to bring in someone who's, in my opinion, probably going to be just way better, and that will kind of service them. And you're right, like you can bring in those coaches who want to work with those top programs, because that's what's going to keep them there and keep them happy. And then that's what helps you from a turnover perspective. And I think that's something that, again, like a year ago, not being in the position I am, I would be like, no, I have to work with football, or I have to work with baseball, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to get my name out. And again, like your perspective and the way I'm starting to kind of transition my mind, it's like, or you can use that as an opportunity to bring in, some really quality people to help the total staff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for me, you hear all the time little bits of advice that, hey, if you're trying to build a staff, you gotta bring in great coaches, right? And that's exactly what I've tried to do, is bring in coaches that ultimately are better than I am. But I mean, that's what I want to do. That's what I believe I've been able to do. Allison's great with men's basketball. I had zero experience prior to this year serving in the interim role. Bree Cans coming in from Stanford. She was with their team and helped coach them to a national championship in 2019. Great experience there. Both working with teams that I helped with, but ultimately I hadn't worked with in the past. And so, yes, I know the basics. I know how to, manage workloads and give them the right exercises and all this stuff, but I didn't have that experience. And so now being able to bring in coaches with a lot more experience than I have is great, because ultimately now, to your point of keeping them on board, hopefully with the financial compensation coupled with the titles and with the growth opportunities and less work, or better work-life balance, hopefully we're not going to get that turnover every year, every 2 years. Maybe, and like I've told them, my goal is if they can stay here for 3 to 5 years, then we're golden. Now, I'm not going to force them to if there are better opportunities out there, but having given them roles, responsibilities, titles, and all these things, now I think for me, it helps make the profession better, because now when they are looking for jobs, they're going to be able to be a little bit more selective about the opportunities they're going to chase down the road.
Yeah. And to kind of piggyback off that, I know that's something that when I first got here, I struggled with, because it seems like every administration is a little bit different. But what is some advice that you could give to coaches as far as creating relationships with the athletic directors and the people in that administrative role? Because at the end of the day, as much as I would love to be like, I'd love to offer a position for X amount of money, my signature is not enough. Mm-hmm. We have to have the other signatures. So what's some of those advice that you would kind of say that you've kind of picked up on to kind of help with bringing in new roles and trying to work on work-life balance or getting new facilities and stuff like that?
Well, like you said, every administration differs. I think the biggest key is, one, first of all, developing a relationship with your senior leadership. So, your AD, some of the other members of the executive team. By relationships, I mean getting to understand what they're looking for, their vision, whether it's for the department or for their little teams within that department. Just kind of going back to when I first came on board, I recall one of the first weekends I was here, springtime, because of the condensed seasons, we had like 3 games going on that day. I think it was baseball, softball, and women's soccer, all right, in the spring. And so went to all 3 events, and the AD was there sitting by herself. So at the first event, baseball, I went, sat down and had a conversation with her, started talking. We transitioned to softball, then went to women's soccer. The whole time we're just having a conversation. Obviously I'd gone through the interview process with her, but just understanding a little bit more about her vision, where she saw things going, asking her how she envisioned me really helping, not just in my role, but in the department as a whole. And so just having those conversations and being able to understand what they're looking for, and then in turn within our department, trying to hit those goals, right? Trying to provide the service that ultimately she's looking for. So I think if you could develop those relationships, once again, the money's not always going to be there for everybody, but I think if you understand what they're looking for and how to communicate, I think that's going to be the biggest thing. Because if you can communicate, then eventually down the road, okay, let's say everybody's money's not the same, but you can at least have a better understanding of how to communicate your needs, wants, and desires for that department and how you envision it growing. Instead of, the term I always use is closed mouths don't get fed. And so a lot of times we'll sit here and we'll complain, hey, they don't understand us. They don't understand what we're doing in sports performance. Well, have you taken the time to communicate that to them? Do you understand what they're looking for so you can communicate in the terms they're looking for and share what you're doing under their terminology? And so I think to me, that's the biggest difference maker, in being able to kind of communicate and have those relationships, so you can just have those one-off conversations and not always require a formal meeting, and hopefully help that senior admin understand a little bit more of what you're doing.
Yeah, and that makes me think about it. It's something that, again, I'm starting to kind of figure out. Was when I first got here, it's like I'm so hyper focused on every single thing that goes on in sports performance, and that's what's super important to like my daily tasks and stuff like that. So obviously I'm going to be super passionate about it, or I'm going to be super understanding about it. And then I go talk to our athletic director, who's super on board with everything. But then I also have to remember I'm meeting one of 10, and everybody that he's talked to already is hyper focused on either their softball or on the COVID stuff or whatever it is. So everything that I think is super important, he has to hear from 9 to 10 other people on their stuff that's also super important. So, and I think that perspective was, so again, something that I, at the beginning, was kind of like, am I not being heard? And then it's like, wait, pause, step back, see what's going on, realize just like I'm only one person, he's only one person, and having to make sure that I keep that perspective, because I'm so hyper focused on my stuff, and I have to be able to slowly help bring what I have going on into kind of his framework. That way he kind of understands what's going on to see what he can do. He might not be able to. He's going to probably he's going to try to do everything he can, but that doesn't mean you ask and you get. It's educate, prove, and then if you're lucky enough, they're gonna help you out with what you need.
Yeah. And I don't want to create this perception that everything's been smooth sailing since I've been here. The reality is, came on board with 3 coaches. We didn't hire our 4th coach until the end of December. So it's taken a full year, right? Like these things don't happen overnight. And I think you brought up a great point, is understanding perspective, being patient. And coaches will sit here all the time and complain. A lot of times you see it on social media. Hey, they don't understand what's going on. They don't support us. We got to kind of take a step back, like you're saying, and examine whether or not they're actually listening and we've been heard, or they're truly ignoring us and they really don't care, right? Like a lot of times, like you said, COVID's a priority. Student mental health and wellness, coming back to school. Those are different things that take, to me, greater priority than training in the weight room. And so just understanding perspective of where we fit in the bigger picture and how we can support the athletic department, I think is important as well. Because as we ask for things, I can sit here and say, hey, we have this great facility. We train all the student athletes. Okay, cool. But now at this point in time, do we need another strength coach, or do we need someone to help work with them for their mental health? Do we need a dietitian that'll have a great impact? Like we should, as coaches, we're going to want to sit here and say, yeah, I want more coaches. I want, we're always fighting for sports performance, but you got to remember, we always talk about rest, recovery, nutrition, all these other things that play a role in the process, we got to look at those things too and understand that sometimes sports performance shouldn't be the priority. As much as we want to complain about things and, fight for things, we need to take a step back sometimes and say, you know what, like we got to push other agendas first, because that's really what's going to help the student athletes more at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we're a part of a bigger team, and that's something I know. Like, I was in the private sector in between my 2 college stints, and that was something that I was almost craving, was kind of having a bigger purpose other than getting kids faster and stronger, because I just felt like a factory, and that's what we were doing. And for me, I just needed to have a little bit bigger of a purpose from being a part of something bigger than who I was and what I was doing. So being a part of that team. Now, being a part of that team also means, yes, you have to advocate for the stuff that's important for you, but also needing to realize someone else needs to eat too. Like, sometimes you have to kind of push your stuff to the side, still fight, still advocate, still do those things. But like I said, perspective on maybe softball needs a new batting cage or whatever it is. Like, those teams might need something that has a little bit more of an impact than what we have going on. So the last thing to kind of pick your brain on before we get out of here is, what's next, as far as we talk about, trying to get into these senior administrative roles. How do you think that kind of happens, and where do you kind of think the next stages of where we're at as far as the profession goes to kind of continue to propel us forward?
I think we're already there as far as understanding what's next. And by that, I mean, there's other coaches with a strength and conditioning background that are moving into these senior roles, right? You got Dr. Pat Ivey at Louisville, just off the top of my head, Bob Alejo at CSUN in a senior AD role, myself here in this role. And then, so we have coaches kind of in those roles and elevating. I think ultimately what's next is elevating the support staff. And so that's what we've tried to do here, by creating 2 assistant AD positions, as well as the, in addition to the director and assistant director spot, by providing titles and compensation. Being able to do that, obviously that requires a lot of support from administration, but by being able to provide that, I think that helps set the standard, as I mentioned before, the table for our coaches. So if they are looking in the future, they are more selective. And I think as we go along, if more and more schools are doing this, and we're raising up, right? We're raising the salary, we're raising titles, whatever it may be, but elevating them up. So when they do look, they're not always just looking to transfer to the next job, not for logo, because sometimes it's not just about that. They're just literally looking to make $5,000 more dollars, $10,000 more dollars, whatever it may be, instead of chasing money, but giving them this platform where now it's like, okay, I am looking ultimately for the best fit because I have the money, I have the title. Now I need all these things to align, plus a fit for whatever your current life goals are, whether that's a family, you want to move to the Midwest, you want to move to the West Coast. So I think that's the biggest thing, is for people in our position. So a Dr. Pat Ivey, Bob Alejo, myself, and others working and fighting to help elevate our staffs as well, and raising their standards, so that when they do go out into the workforce and leave us, they are heading into better positions, and understand also, and educating them on how to fight to elevate their staffs as well. And I don't think this is going to happen overnight, but I think there are enough coaches out there in these roles now fighting for these things, and we are having these types of discussions that, I've told my AD I would like to be an athletic director one day, right? And so being able to verbalize that, I think that's another thing too, is expressing these desires and these goals. Because if you don't tell someone, Courtney saying, I said already, closed mouths don't get fed, nobody's going to know and mentor you along the path. And so now that I've expressed that, she's even talked to me about it. Okay, this is what you want to do. We'll help guide you along that path and see if that's where you end up being. But if we don't have it, the other thing too is we can't force coaches to have this desire to be senior leadership, or, to be athletic directors. Now, if they do want to make an impact, definitely that's something that we're going to have to pursue. And so I think being able to express those things and be able to, seek mentorship, not just from the people at your institution, but from others, I think is going to definitely help.
With those titles, something that I think about, like, are there outside of the weight room kind of responsibilities and roles that come along with those for you guys, and what exactly do those look like?
So everybody with an AD title has additional roles and responsibilities outside our weight room. Not necessarily always drawn out on paper, but weekly they're meeting. So Allison, Bree, myself, and our other admin team meets with the AD on a weekly basis. So we're getting a pulse for what's going on in the athletic department, giving updates on what our projects are that we're working on and how we're helping support the athletic department. And then because it's a group of assistant ADs, associate ADs, and senior ADs meeting with Renee, we're able to hear what everybody else is doing and then offer our services to assist and help get things done. And so we all have our roles and responsibilities within our individual departments, but then being able to help collaborate on different projects, bigger, higher level projects, whether it's trying to bring in tournaments, right? Like we're not in operations, but we're now assisting, helping out with tournament setup or whatever it may be. So just being able to have those conversations opens the door, and I think gives them, them being our staff, the chance to collaborate with other people outside the department. For me, that's the most important part, is collaborating with other leaders outside of our department, academics, the NIL stuff that we got going on now, whether it's marketing, fundraising, being able to interact with all those different individuals on a regular basis, I think is the added benefit of having those titles, at least at our institution, because now we meet with the AD on a regular basis. So it's a face-to-face connection, whether it's in person or in Zoom. We're able to connect and foster these relationships with people outside our department who, in all reality, are going to be leaders one day in this field.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about having a seat at the table. That's quite literally a seat at the table. So, I mean, that's, I kind of, it seems like that's going to be kind of the shift, because again, you can't advocate for your department if you're speaking to the athletic director once a month or for whatever those reasons are. So, I mean, that I'm excited for that future for our industry, because I think that's going to give us a little bit of a kind of a step up other than just the weights guy or and stuff like that. I mean, you're going to have to, show up to those meetings on time, and you going to probably have to dress a specific way and stuff like that. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. Might be different than what we have going on right now. I mean, I'm wearing a t-shirt and shorts right now myself, but I know there's a time and place where I need to put the polo on, or I got to put the blazer on, whatever it is. Not getting offended because they ask you to dress up. And I couldn't believe I heard somebody say like I should be able to wear what I want when I want. And it's like, okay, or you can be a team player, and it's part of it.
No. And you I'm sure you've heard this before. You don't, you go to those meetings, you're not dressing for the job you have, you're dressing for the job you want. And you got to play the role. That's the reality. I mean, listen, they're not showing up to their meetings with the other ADs and presidents and whatever, wearing whatever the hell they want. That's not how it works. There's a level of professionalism that I think we as strength coaches need to remember still exists. We're privileged to have this opportunity to be relaxed at work, whether it's wearing joggers, shorts, pullovers, and we think, wearing a polo is dressing up. The reality is we got to be, if we are as a field going to move into these upper level positions along the way, so too will our wardrobe. Like, that's the reality. Like, we got to be able to adapt to that.
Yeah, I know my mentor at my last school, I would always give him a hard time because he would have in the closet, he'd have like a backup button-up blazer pants in the closet at all time. And I always give him a hard time. I'm like, you're never going to wear those. And son of a gun, one day he had like a really important like regional type deal with the AD, and it was super last minute. And luckily he had it. And that was because his mentor did the same thing. And if I ever get a closet, maybe I'll do that as well. But well, hey, I also like to kind of flip this around, and don't know if you have any possible questions you might have for me, or that you kind of like to talk about as well before we jump off this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is how someone like myself can help others, right? Like, and by that I mean I'm not the guy that you're going to see lecturing at any of these big conferences or presenting on any groundbreaking research. Quite frankly, I'm dumb compared to my peers. That's the way I view myself. I like to learn from others and then help disseminate that information to the students and staff and all that. But how could someone like myself in the position I'm in currently help others out and provide a resource or whatever it may be? I mean, maybe there's nothing for me to help on, but I'd love to help if possible, just because I think I've been mentored and helped along the ways. I mean, the reason I'm in the position I'm in now is because of mentors along the way or others that have just taken the time to speak to me and give me bits of advice, even though like it may not have pertained to my situation at the time. They just gave me whatever advice they had to share along the way.
Yeah, well, I would say talking at those conferences, to be honest with you, would be something that, like, from a fresh perspective, I'd like to hear. I've heard, and I'm haven't even been around that long, but I've heard a bunch about hamstrings. I've heard a bunch about the low back. I've heard a bunch about that type of stuff. But I'm in the position now where I'm trying to grow a department from scratch. So being able to talk to someone who's got a department that ideally would be something that I'd like to strive for in relativity of to my, scalable and where I'm at. But I think hearing conversations and the kind of the harder times that you've kind of gone through at those conferences and clinics is something that I hope we start to hear a little bit more about. Again, I understand sometimes those conferences are part of the, sandbag training and all that's kind of part of it. But I also would like think that it would be a more professional development for that type of stuff to hear from coaches and see kind of how you do it. Or like I know at University of West Florida, Kent Morgan has a completely different model where he's the director and he's got like 8 GAs, and they're still winning Division II national championships and pretty much everything, but they have a turnover every 1 to 2 years. It works. So hearing from him on how that works for, his school and kind of his perspective on that, I think that kind of stuff is the stuff that I know I'm craving to hear from, which is why I love to do these conversations. We all had a podcast during COVID, and that was something that I would reach out to the people that I wanted to hear from, regardless of if I thought that they would respond to a DM that I would send them on Instagram and Twitter, and son of a gun, they did. And I learned a crap ton from that. So I would say continue to like challenge yourself on that, because it helps us out a bunch. And I know it takes time out. It's valuable. People want to hear it. So I would say probably that. And then doing stuff like this has been incredibly helpful for me. 30 to 45 minutes with people who I look up to, and now I have a conversation with. I can now help my interns because of some of the perspective that you shared me and the great mentorship that I have. And I always say like my mentors over a couple people, but anybody I talk to through this, I consider as like a mentor. From you are sharing perspective on what you've done, mistakes you've made, to hopefully I don't make those same mistakes, where if I do make those mistakes, ways to kind of get out of that.
Cool. I think the last thing I'll leave you with is a little more personal, but my advice would be to prioritize mental health. I mean, for you, you may not be dealing with anything, and that's fine if you're not, but staff members, friends, different things like that. I've gone on a couple podcasts recently and did a presentation and shared my story then, and I didn't mention it earlier, but in 2018, I got within one exit of driving off a cliff intentionally and taking my own life, and just being in a very dark place. And I think the piece of advice I'd give for coaches too is it's not always gravy. This was a year after I'd won a championship in Canada, was living a great life, getting paid well, had a great work-life balance, but I was just in a very dark place. And so my advice would be to, for other coaches that end up listening to this or know someone that's struggling, or maybe they're struggling themselves, is to just reach out and ask for help, because it's worth it. It's worth it to ask for help and be vulnerable.
Yeah, we'll end it there. I love that. I think that's it. But Awesome, Coach. Well, hey, I appreciate your time as always. Super valuable. For those who are in the Discord, check out the college strength coach SIG. Well, I know Coach has been there, kind of chatting it up a little bit. So take advantage of that. If there's any questions you guys have, throw them in there. That's just a great place kind of for us to come together. Coach, also, I'll put your socials in the description if you don't mind, for if anybody wants to reach out. Again, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Have a great day, man. Take care. Appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome, Coach. Well, hey, thank you so much, man. Again, this is the kind of stuff that I love to do. So again, if there's anything I can do, please let me know. I'd love to help out any way I can.
Appreciate it. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, Coach. Have a good one.
Bye.
See ya.